Right, now it's time for our first esteemed speaker, Ms. Clara Chiu, Director of Licensing and Head of Fintech Unit at the SFC. Welcome, Clara, and good afternoon to you. Welcome physically to the Academy of Finance. Now, I understand Clara will be sharing her views on the virtual asset landscape and trend, and she will also provide an overview of the SFC's regulatory approach and framework for centralized virtual asset trading, other activities such as crypto fund management and distribution, security token offering, etc. So over to you, Clara.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's my honor today to be here talking about the SFC regulation of virtual assets. Before we go into details of our regulatory framework, please bear with me just a minute for me to briefly introduce or refresh everyone as to the SFC regulatory remit. The reason for this is because we don't have a separate regulatory framework for virtual asset or fintech. So sometimes it's a little bit confusing as to, what is the legal remit of the SFC in relation to a particular fintech activity. That's why I want to, spend a few minutes to talk about the SFC regulatory remit first. When we talk about the SFC legal powers, of course, we have to talk about and look into the Securities and Futures Ordinance. And in the Securities and Futures Ordinance, it is stipulated that there are 10 different types of regulated activities. And for anyone who wants to engage in these any regulated activities in Hong Kong, he or she has to get the license from the SFC. So I have set out here the 10 different types of regulated activities here. So you can see type 1 is dealing in securities, is usually like the broker business, and then type 10 is providing credit rating services in Hong Kong. And then other than these regulated activities, or we call activity-based regulatory remit that the SFC has, there is also something called the authorization or registration regimes in Hong Kong, the details of which you can see Part 4 to the SFC or Schedule 17 to the Companies Ordinance. So this is a brief introduction as to the SFC regulatory remit. Here you can see, I set out here all the recent SFC publications on fintech. There are two colors. There are some boxes in green and some boxes in red. Those boxes in green are more like technology-related circulars or publication, and then the publications in red are the publication more related to the crypto or virtual assets area. As you can see from this page, in fact, the SFC, we don't just focus on virtual assets, but of course, virtual assets is a big area. That's why we also have a lot of publications on these. But we also have circulars on robo-advisor or remote client onboarding or these. And then if we focus on the virtual assets landscape in Hong Kong or globally, nowadays we have more than 9,000 different digital tokens. Of course, the ones more well-known Bitcoins, Ethers, and Litecoin, all these. And the total market cap of the whole crypto market nowadays is over $2 trillion. And just for Bitcoin, the total market cap of Bitcoin is more than $1 trillion. It's quite a lot, and is bigger than, let's say, Tesla. Tesla's market cap is around 670 billion only. So, but for Bitcoin, as I said, is more than $1 trillion. And about the virtual assets, the Hong Kong regulatory framework for virtual assets, I said briefly here, we have some very specific, clear regulations on the virtual assets, especially on the virtual assets trading platforms area, virtual assets fund managers and distributors, and security tokens offerings. So maybe let's go to, VA trading platforms first. This picture, you can see, I just screen cap a typical cryptocurrency exchange here. You can see its business mode is a bit like a hybrid of traditional brokerage business and also RA7 automated trading platforms. And then this kind of platform usually matches buyers and sellers' orders. And there are some platforms, they call themselves as centralized trading platforms. Some call themselves as decentralized trading platforms. And in Hong Kong, we only regulate centralized VA trading platforms. For those decentralized trading platforms, they are more like P2P transactions, virtual assets transaction platforms. So about the existing regulatory framework for virtual trading platforms, the very specific paper or publications we have issued so far are these two. One is the conceptual framework for the potential regulation on virtual asset trading platform operators. At that time, in that paper, we said that interested parties, please come to the SFC and discuss with us, because we really want to explore whether our proposed regulatory framework will be workable or not, because we are not in that industry. And at that time, this industry was really new. We really want to have more interaction and dialogues with these trading platforms so that we could learn more their business model, and they could also honestly tell us whether they believe our proposals were workable or not workable, so that we can further refine the regulatory framework. After hearing all their comments and then learned more about their business model, we refine our concept. That's why we issue another paper, is the position paper in November 2019, in which we confirmed our regulatory framework. Now you have heard from me the existing regulatory framework for VA trading platforms. Now maybe I show you the details of what the regulatory framework is. Maybe let's play a video, a very short one, which outlines our SFC regulatory regime for the virtual asset platform, trading platforms.
The Hong Kong SFC regulatory framework for virtual asset trading platforms came into effect in November 2019. We are one of the leading regulators creating a comprehensive framework with licensing, conduct, financial, and AML requirements. It was great news to the fintech and crypto world. A compliant platform could now apply for a license and have a clear idea as to how they could comply with the legal and regulatory requirements. Under the framework, the SFC could give license to a centralized crypto exchange which is incorporated in Hong Kong. There is in fact no special license called Virtual Asset Trading Platform License. The applicant, in effect, will get an SFC license under the Securities and Futures Ordinance for Type 1 and 7 regulated activities. As the SFC only has power to give license to securities and futures business, centralized crypto exchanges must also be providing trading service in security tokens, so as to make themselves fall within the jurisdiction of the SFC. The applicants must be prepared to commit themselves in complying with the regulatory requirements which are to be imposed as licensing conditions. For example, it must be prepared to serve professional investors only. It must be financially robust and must have good systems to do KYC, detect market misconduct activities, and prevent money laundering. There are other requirements which are more from investor protection angle. For example, the platform operator will be required to put in place an insurance policy. Further, 98% of client virtual assets should be kept in a cold wallet. Private key of the wallet must also be safely stored. With a robust regulatory framework, we believe that investor interest will be protected. Our licensed virtual asset trading platforms in Hong Kong could be recognized as providing top services having complied with high regulatory standards. Our regulatory framework in Hong Kong will support the healthy and orderly development of the crypto asset business.
Hope that you enjoy the video. And then maybe I just very briefly to recap our regulatory framework. Yes, as you have just heard, in 2017, when the SFC explored or considered whether we should regulate cryptocurrency, virtual asset or not in Hong Kong, we of course we had a lot of different deliberations, and then but finally we considered that there may not be really a choice for us, because for virtual assets, in fact, they already spread to the securities sector. For example, you can see lots of like security features, crypto asset, virtual assets, and then some futures, crypto futures, and all these, and also crypto funds, of course. So at that time, we decided that probably we needed to regulate this area. But at that time, there was legal questions, because we are the Securities and Futures Commission. We regulate the securities and futures market only. For Bitcoin or Ethers, they are not securities and not futures. Then whether we really have the legal powers to regulate them. So we kind of like adopt approach and try to see whether within the SFC legal limit we can do something, so we can also regulate this kind of activities. So at that time, also some virtual asset trading platforms, they came to us and said they really want to get a license. So what we finally came up with was an innovative idea. We told all these interested parties that if you really want to get our license, okay, you can continue to run your platform, but on your platform, at least you have to add some securities elements. You must trade at least one securities futures tokens, so that your business will have a security business element, so that the SFC could have powers to regulate and license you, give license to this kind of business venture. And then for another legal limitation questions that we faced at that time was, we are afraid that, if, okay, we are going to give a license to a virtual trading platform, and then on that platform, they trade 99% of their tokens are utility tokens. They're not securities. They're not future contracts, but only 1 or 2 are security tokens. And then if any problems arise later, they will argue with us saying, no, SFC, sorry, you don't have jurisdiction over these kind of utility tokens activities, because they are not securities, they are not futures contracts. So for us, we made very clear before this licensing stage, we said that if you would like to come to us and get a license, you have to voluntarily submit jurisdiction to the SFC, so that when we regulate, when we give license, we give the license to the business as a whole, to the corporation as a whole. So we have jurisdiction over all the business activities of your company, not just part of it, which relates to security tokens activities. So this is another innovative idea in this regulatory regime that is, very new to our whole regulatory remit. And so, here are the entities to be licensed. It must be a Hong Kong incorporated company. And then the relevant license will be RA 1 and 7. And for anyone any platforms who gets a license will also impose some license conditions and regulatory requirements on it. And for example, it could only serve professional investors only. For the definition of professional investors, as most of you know, it will be found in the SFC subsidiary legislation, the PI rules, and in a nutshell, it should be someone should have at least $8 million portfolio. And then we also impose some licensing conditions and make some specific requirements as to how the licensed corporation, the VA trading platform, could safely keep clients' assets. So we have some requirements as to the safe custody of client assets. For example, those clients and house assets must be properly segregated. And then, as you have heard from the video, there will be 98% of the client assets must be in cold wallet instead of hot wallet. And they also must have an insurance policy to cover the risk. And of course, this kind of virtual assets platform must comply with our legal and regulatory requirements as well as the international FATF requirements in relation to AML aspect. And we also stress that this kind of licensed virtual asset trading platforms, they must have good surveillance system so as to detect any market abuse activities on their system. For example, if they detect that some of their customers are maybe suspected to be engaging in these MM activities, they must immediately freeze the client's account or stop those kind of activities on their platforms. And then lastly, they must do a lot of due diligence on the virtual assets they are going to put on their platforms. This is very important from the investor protection perspective. So maybe you have heard that there is another proposed regulatory framework for real trading platform. That framework was proposed by the FSTB, the government, and the consultation paper was issued in November 2020. The consultation conclusion has not been published, but I believe it will be released very soon. The main difference between that proposed regulatory framework from the existing SFC regulatory framework is that in the proposed regulatory framework, a virtual asset trading platforms in Hong Kong must get a license, whether it is trading any security token or not. So if this proposal is passed, and when this proposal is effective, maybe let's say a few years later, any cryptocurrency virtual asset trading platform in Hong Kong has to get a license. So if that virtual asset trading platform has a security token on their platform, then they must get a license under the SFO. But if the virtual asset trading platform doesn't trade any security token, but just some utility token or Bitcoin or Ether, then they have to get a license under the AMLO. Even though for both regulatory frameworks, the SFC will be the regulator to give license and supervise these platforms. Lastly, about the virtual asset trading platforms, in fact, for us, the Hong Kong SFC virtual asset trading platform, this regulatory regime is kind of pioneer internationally. So when we had this announced our regulatory framework in 2019, it was very new, and we are one of the leading regulators in this area. And you can see I set out here, Singapore, UK, Australia, USA, all of them, they also regulate virtual asset platforms to a certain extent. For example, like Singapore, they regulate it under the Payment Services Act. It's kind of like they are regulating these kind of activities under their payment regulation. But that payment regulation, they are more from the AML or cybersecurity perspective. And in the UK, it is more from the AML and disclosure perspective. In Australia, it's kind of like a registration regime or reporting obligation. And in USA, maybe you have heard the BIT license, that is the New York State Department of Financial Services license. That one not apply, in the whole United States. That is a robust regime, or comprehensive from investor protection as well. And our Hong Kong regime is more like this Bitcoin license, that regime, because for our regime in Hong Kong, it is a comprehensive one. We not just focus on AML or disclosure or cybersecurity. It's all in one, inclusive. So it's more an investor protection comprehensive regime. So other than the VA trading platform regime, we also have regulatory framework for VA fund managers and distributors. I said here the three major publications that the SFC issued in the last 2 or 3 years. And then you can see it's more on VA portfolio manager, that means VA fund manager and distributor. Have a look about the regulatory framework for VA fund managers. And then the entities to be licensed will be the licensed fund manager. That is, other than managing a VA fund, the fund manager must also be managing a portfolio of securities or futures contracts. What we put here is that, in fact, for crypto fund manager, usually they will also get our RA9, Type 9 license, that is asset management. And if you check the SFO for asset management, RA9, the definition of it includes managing a portfolio of securities and futures contracts. As I mentioned earlier, Bitcoin or ETHs, they are not securities or futures. So if someone comes to us and if he is only managing a fund, a private fund, just one private fund, and then the whole portfolio of it is just Bitcoin and Ether, we say, sorry, we can't give you a license because you are not managing a portfolio of securities and futures contracts. So because this is the legal definition of RA9. But if a licensed fund manager, that means if a licensed fund manager already, he's managing a few other mutual funds, with securities or futures in the portfolio. And then now he's going to set up a new fund, and the new fund is crypto fund. The investment in crypto, Bitcoins and Ether, then we have jurisdiction because this is a licensed fund managers anyway, and it can, this fund manager can get our RA9 license. And then for these kind of licensed fund manager managing crypto funds, we will also impose some licensing condition. For example, we will ask them to have very high standard risk management policy in relation to the concentration risk, and the liquidity risk management must be managed properly. And then they also must have some contingency plan or disaster recovery plan. And then they also have to conduct due diligence in selecting the valuation principles. The principles, of course, must be reasonable. And then they must also appoint independent auditors to audit the financial statements of the fund. And then the appointed independent auditors must have experience in this area or capability to do this work. And when this fund manager to select custodians, they also have to exercise due diligence. And then, for example, they have to consider the regulatory status of these custodians and their capability and all these. For VA fund distributor, is more focused on the selling practice. So usually they would get our RA1 license. And for these, we will also expect that for VA funds, they should be distributed to professional investors only. And then proper disclosure about the fund to investors. And lastly, as you may have heard, there is a term STOs, security tokens offerings. It's kind of a new trend in the virtual asset industry. And then in Hong Kong, we also have some kind of STOs ongoing. We issued a circular about this 2 years ago, and because at that time we see that there was growing interest and demand in this area. So we try to provide a clear regulatory outline or framework for them. But we still see that there are some STOs activities in Hong Kong ongoing. They are working on this with some professionals, the blockchain companies or token companies are working with some traditional like RA1 or RA4, RA6 to see how they are going to do this in Hong Kong. And they're still work in progress, I have to say. And they're still working. We haven't seen security token offering actually came out in Hong Kong. But I hope that there will be, this kind of STO, proper structure, and then with investor protection in mind to be in Hong Kong soon. Thank you very much. This is the end of my presentation.
Right, thank you, Clara, for the very comprehensive introduction on how SFC has approached the topic of virtual assets.